Okay.
Now we are.
Good. So we're ready to go. Okay. So welcome everybody to this week's VSAT. We are very happy to have Leeat Yariv, who's going to present Disentangling Exploration from Exploitation. And we are also very happy to have Nicolas Klein, who is going to ask questions as our expert panelist. And before we start, next week we have Laura Doval, who's presenting Persuasion and Welfare. And you can find information about our upcoming talks, the few that are left until the summer, on our website. And there you can also find links to the recordings of our previous talks if you want to rewatch them. All right, so we're ready to go. So, Leeat, the screen is yours.
Thank you very much.
Just one second, I forgot to say, so today, as far as I can see, so far we don't have a co-author here.
Eran is here, actually.
So if you're here and if you have time, you could answer questions in the chat. So yeah, if people have questions in the chat, they can post them there, or if not, or if you prefer, you can unmute yourself and ask questions during the talk.
No.
Okay, thank you. Go ahead.
Thank you very much. Yes, so this is a joint project with Alessandro Lizzeri and Eran Shmaya. Eran is here, so hopefully he can man the chat. I'm a terrible multitasker, so if you want to ask me anything, just please interrupt. The experimentation models, which are at the heart of this project, are relevant for many decision-making processes. So in fact, many decisions are preceded by experimentation, and as a consequence, there is a vast literature on experimentation, and in particular through bandits, which is what we'll focus on today. So so we're all on the same page, let me describe to you the classical multi-armed bandit problem. The word bandit comes from the context of casinos. So each slot machine here is often referred to as a bandit. And the basic ingredients of this problem are that you have multiple projects with uncertain returns. These are the bandits or the slot machines. And at each period, you can sample one project. So say, pull the arm of one slot machine or bandit. And so you get a reward, which also provides you with information about the distribution that underlies that project. So the rewards and the information are intertwined. Now, there are many applications for this problem. Perhaps the first person to kind of suggest it was Thompson in 1933. He was thinking about clinical trials. And in fact, even Gittins and Jones, who are kind of possibly the most famous players in this literature, suggested that this was their motivation for thinking about it. So just to cite them, their multi-armed bandits' chief practical motivation comes from clinical trials. Now, they've been used for a variety of applications, as I already mentioned. So for instance, political reforms, where you're trying to understand the efficacy of the reform, monopoly pricing decision, where you actually need to suggest a price in the market in order to observe the demand that ensues, labor market choices, where, for instance, you might need to employ someone to really learn about the quality of the match or the ability of the employee in your job, venture capital, where you need to invest in a project to see whether it's indeed promising, and so on and so forth. Now, in the classical problem, signals and payoffs are intertwined essentially by assumptions. So the underlying trade-off is between learning or exploration and payoffs or exploitation. And this is what's often referred to as the exploration-exploitation trade-off or dilemma. this was considered a very hard problem. And in fact, Peter Whittle, who is another big player in this literature, in 1979, he said the problem is a classic one. It was formulated during the war. He means the World War II, and efforts to solve it so sapped energies and minds of Allied analysts that suggestion was made that the problem be dropped over Germany as the ultimate instrument of intellectual sabotage. Now, thankfully, in 1979, in fact, John C. Gittins actually came up with a solution. And the solution is the following. So you have a score, that's what we often nickname the Gittins index, that you adjust for each project that you use. And at every period, you use the project that has the highest score. What makes this solution remarkable is that these scores get adjusted in a separable fashion. So at every period, you create a score for each project that is completely independent of what had transpired with other projects. Now, there are multiple implications of this, and this problem has been heavily studied, but just to mention a few that will be relevant for us, you might exploit the myopically inferior project to learn. That's really just a reflection of the dilemma between exploration and exploitation. You might switch between projects many times as you learn, and we'll see some examples of that throughout the talk. And importantly, in the long run, you might get stuck on an inefficient project. So in this, even when you use the optimal strategy, you won't necessarily converge to the optimal project in reality. Okay, so now our project. So in our project, we're going to allow agents to separate exploration from exploitation. And we think this is relevant for a variety of applications. So just to give you a bunch of examples, you might think about a politician who considers a new policy and therefore collects data only on the new policy, but not on the status quo. You can think about investing in your retirement savings and exploring stocks that you're not invested in. So you're collecting payoff from something that you're not learning about. Even on-the-job search has some flavor of this sort of separation, where you might explore opportunities with other employers without going to your boss and kind of having a discussion about your future prospects on the job. So our goal is to understand the implications on both the optimal strategies or the behavior of agents and the longer run outcomes that they produce. And just to give you a kind of refined goals and insights of what we do, we're going to focus on two Poisson bandits. As it turns out, the type of Gittins solution via the score or index is no longer going to be valid. There's going to be long-run efficiency with any level of disentanglement. So you always converge to the superior project. The optimal policy entails lots of persistence, so not so much switching as might occur in the classical setting. And naturally, you have improved expected discounted payoffs. That's not shocking because we give the agent more leverage. We give them more freedom on the type of policies that can use. But that advantage is particularly pronounced for intermediate values of parameters. All right, just to put this in context of the literature, this is a relatively short talk, so I won't go into details of anything, but I'll just highlight the threads of literature that are related. So first of all, Poisson bandits, which is what we're focusing on today, they are related to the classical work by Robbins and Gittins. But what brought them to popularity in the economics literature are perhaps the papers by Keller, Roddy, and Cripps, and Keller and Roddy, and you'll see more details on these precise models in a few moments. Recently, there is a literature that focuses on dynamic choice of information sources, kind of in the context of media choice, for instance. So to some extent, this is a related problem to the problem we're thinking of, but without the payoffs arriving over time. Rational inattention is qualitatively or conceptually related because in a way, which project to explore can be thought of as which project to attend to. So in some sense, it's another model of rational inattention. And last, I'll mention a very nice literature in computer science that tries to think about useful algorithms for finding quickly the best project in these settings. All right, so this is what I plan to do to you in the next 50 minutes. I'll go through the general model first, and then we'll focus on a very special case of a one-safe project, just to kind of show you some of the forces in the model. And then hopefully I have time to spend on the case in which there are two risky projects, and that will be it. Any questions before I dive in? Cool. All right, so here's the model. So the agent selects one of two projects, L or H, which will stand for low or high, you'll see why, in continuous time. Each project, either low or high, can be good or bad, and whether they're good or bad is determined independently across the projects. So project X is good with probability P sub X, and it's bad with the complementary probability 1 minus Px. Now, if project X is good, it pays a flow reward of R sub X, and if it's bad, it pays 0 forever. And the reason why we use this nomenclature of L and H is because a good project H generates higher rewards than a good project L. And both of these rewards are 0. So really your task is to figure out which, if any, of the projects is good. Now, the exploration works as follows. So at any moment, the agent chooses what to explore and what to exploit. Exploration is going to be costless. So at each moment, you have a unit budget to allocate to which project to explore. So in that sense, you can think about it as a budget of attention, and you need to figure out how to allocate that budget of attention. So if you spend a fraction alpha sub X of the budget exploring project X, then you may receive conclusive news. If project X is good, then good news arrives at a Poisson rate, which is proportional to how much you invested in exploring the project, alpha X, and an exogenous arrival rate, lambda XG, so G for good. If project X is bad, then the same thing, you receive bad news at a Poisson rate, which is proportional to how much you invested in the project in terms of exploration, and an exogenous arrival rate, lambda XB, where B for bad. Now, let me just highlight the fact that this encompasses several classic settings in the literature. So for instance, the classic good news case corresponds to what Keller, Roddy, and Cripps suggested. And that's an edge case where the good news, if a project is good, you receive news at a positive rate, but bad news never arrives. The classic bad news that was suggested by Keller and Roddy corresponds to a situation where bad news arrives at a positive rate when the project is bad, but you never receive good news. Now, in my opinion, this is in some sense misnomer, these labels, because really what matters in all of these settings is the information that's conveyed with no news. So in the good news case, when you observe no news, you become increasingly pessimistic. Whereas in the bad news case, when you receive no news, you become increasingly optimistic. And really what matters is the difference between the arrival rates of good news and bad news. So just to put it in pictures, on the left panel here, you see the good news case where good news arrives at a higher rate. And if you focus on a particular project, as time goes by and you've seen no news, you become increasingly pessimistic. With bad news on the right panel, as time goes by and you've seen no news, you become increasingly optimistic. All right, so now the exploitation. So at any moment, the agent chooses also the project to exploit. Now, the project that you exploit is what will determine the ultimate payoffs, but they are unobserved. So the only thing you observe comes from which the projects you explore. Exploitation only affects the payoffs. Payoffs are discounted at the fixed rate R. Now, one thing I'll highlight here is that for this talk, I'm assuming that the agent chooses one project or the other. Of course, you could also think about something more continuous, just like we did with the exploration, where you split the budget of exploitation as well. This will not affect almost everything that I tell you today, so this is just done for simplicity of presentation. But ultimately, what we analyze is something that mirrors the exploration. Now, we want to map the classical model to a model in which everything is disentangled, and to kind of trace the full spectrum of disentanglement. We'll focus on what we call the alpha constrained decision process. So in the alpha constrained decision process, whenever the agent exploits project X, they must collect some information on it. So they must allocate at least a fraction alpha to also exploring it. So just to kind of highlight the edge cases here, when alpha equals to 1, this is basically the standard model. Whenever you exploit a project, you must also explore it. So this is the fully entangled model. When alpha equals to 0, on the other hand, there's full disentanglement. So your exploitation choice doesn't constrain you at all in terms of the exploration. Okay, so for the first observation that we have here is the following. So for any alpha, which is less than 1, so whenever you can disentangle to some extent, the agent will asymptotically exploit the best project available. And the intuition here is pretty straightforward. Effectively, whenever you have something still to learn that could improve your payoffs, if you have the ability to disentangle, you'll use the myopically optimal project to exploit, and you can still continue learning. So there's always an opportunity to learn without sacrificing payoffs. So that's the intuition here. Now, this is in stark contrast with what happens in the alpha equals to 1 case, the classical case where everything is fully entangled, where generically you can get stuck on a suboptimal project. So this already highlights contrast between the fully entangled case and anything that allows for even a tiny bit of disentanglement. Now, of course, it may take a very long time to learn which is the best project, and our agent discounts. So when we think about payoffs, we'll need to kind of trade these things off, the learning against the time that has transpired, and this is something we'll be interested in. All right, so that's it for the model, unless someone wants to bug me, and I'll start talking about results. All right, so we'll start with the one safe project. This is a special case in our model that might seem very simplistic, but it is the case that has been arguably the most heavily studied in the literature in economics. And it corresponds to the setting in which one of the projects is safe or certain. In our setting, basically it translates to the probability of the low project being good equaling 1. So project L is safe, but it generates a lower reward than a good project H. So there is still some tension, because you might want to explore project H in order to learn whether it's good or not. So there's some value to learning still. All right, so let's start with the case of good news. So the arrival rate of good news is greater than the arrival rate of bad news, which means that no news is bad news. So here, exploration is trivial. There's only uncertainty about project H. So clearly you want to explore project H as much as possible. Exploitation, however, is less trivial because exploitation in our model constrains how much you can explore project H through this constraint of alpha. So whenever you exploit project L, for instance, you won't be able to explore project H to the full extent. So that's kind of the trade-off here. Now, when alpha equals to 0, there's full disentanglement, and then the problem becomes very simple. You exploit project H if and only if it's myopically optimal for you. And that corresponds to a threshold on the posterior that project H is good, which exceeds the ratio of the rewards from the low project and the high project. Okay, this just means that the expected value of the high project is greater or equal than the low project. So at any moment you do that and you explore only project H. Now, when alpha is greater than 0, you might exploit project H even when it's myopically suboptimal in order to increase your learning from it. So let me just show it to you in a picture. Okay, here it is in a picture. So this is kind of the myopic threshold for using project H. And it might be that in some region here, this is this green region, you exploit project H in order to learn. So just to kind of make clear the underlying trade-off, you want to either exploit project L when it's myopically optimal and explore H at the rate of 1 minus alpha, or you might exploit and explore a myopically inferior project H in order to maximize learning. So now I'm going to show you kind of how to derive that cutoff of when you exploit project H. And I'm going to go through a small derivation just because it's a little bit different than what the literature has used so far, and it might be insightful for some of the results later on. So if exploiting L and exploring H at the rate of 1 minus alpha is optimal, it means that any other deviation generates a lower payoff. So in particular, exploiting L is superior to exploiting H instead for a small duration delta and then reverting back to L. So now we can write the inequality that corresponds to this preference ordering. And I know this is a monstrous equation. I don't expect you to kind of digest every item here. I'll just walk you through it and hopefully you get an intuition for what's going on here. So the first term just corresponds to the immediate flow payoff difference, the advantage of L over H, which is myopically inferior. The second term corresponds to the information loss from using from exploiting project L, which is superior. Now, just to kind of break this down, the second term here has several components. So first of all, the information benefit from H is just the probability that you get good news in this small period of time delta, times the probability that otherwise you would not get these good news, that otherwise you would die before news. So this is kind of thinking about the discount rates and arrival rates as hazard rates if you want an additional intuition. Okay, so if you believe us that this is the equation,
is there no benefit from getting bad news?
Exactly. So it's second order.
Okay.
Yeah,
it's
that's exactly the point. You're spot on.
Okay,
So
that's okay. Sorry.
is that okay?
Sure. Yeah, it's a bit surprising, isn't it?
Yes. Yeah.
So,
So I just showed you. I mean, the main thing to focus on here is that the benefit from exploiting H longer is learning that it's actually good, right? That depends only on the arrival rate of good news.
but suppose I get bad news at delta over 2, then I could switch. Okay, it's second order in delta. Now I got
It's second order in
okay.
delta. Yeah, so there will be terms that depend on the bad rates, but it will be second order. And we'll, soon as you'll see, we'll take delta to 0. So that's why we can safely ignore them. But I'll give you another intuition if that one doesn't work. But Nicolas is spot on that the interesting thing about this formula, the reason why I'm showing it to you, is that it doesn't depend on the rate of arrival of bad news. So in particular, you will get the same constraint even if the bad news arrival rate is very close to the arrival rate of good news. In fact, you can take the limit and arrive at this case that we called balanced news, where the arrival rate of good news and bad news precisely coincide. So then we would get the same constraint. And if we take the limit as delta goes to 0 and we simplify, we get a nice formula for the cutoff. And this is a well-behaved cutoff. It's when alpha equals to 1, which corresponds to the classical model, we indeed get the threshold that was identified in Keller, Roddy, and Krebs, so what people often use in the literature. And as alpha decreases, as the constraint becomes more and more lax, this cutoff increases. It approaches the myopic cutoff. In fact, when you have full disentanglement, that's basically what we said before. You just follow the myopic cutoff. So it's kind of, these are just sanity checks that our algebra is right. Okay, now let's look at the bad news. So suppose that bad news arrives at a higher rate than good news. So no news is good news. Now you become more optimistic as time goes by. So now we can do the same sort of trick, and I won't go through all the algebra of that. But if exploiting and exploring project H is optimal, it means that it's superior to any possible deviation. In particular, you can think about an analogous deviation where you exploit project L for a small duration delta, and then you switch back to H. And as it turns out, a similar, almost identical derivation will get you to see that this depends only on the arrival of bad news. So in particular, it should be satisfied even when we take the good news arrival to approach the bad news arrival rate, or when they coincide. So in other words, this indicates that we're going to get exactly the same threshold as in the good news setting. So in fact, this is proposition 1. So when we have one safe project, what really matters for the cutoff of exploitation is only the maximum between the arrival rates, good news or bad news. And you have a nice formula that exhibits natural comparative statics. It's decreasing in alpha, which captures the extent of the constraint or disentanglement on the relative rewards of the high and low projects, and in the discount rate R. And in fact, when alpha is greater than 0, it's also decreasing in lambda. Lambda, the arrival rate, and patience are kind of interchangeable in this model. And this is related to a formulation in Chen Horner. They were interested in kind of recommender systems, a very different model. But if you look at their appendix, it's very nice, and it has results that is kind of connected to this. All right. Now the fact, yeah.
Now you've presented the argument as a necessary condition, right? So this kind of is
Yes.
the sufficiency trivial, or you just
It's
have
almost
existence,
trivial. It's almost
then...
trivial. It's you can think about any particular deviation as sort of a convex combination of these sorts of deviations with various delays. So you can sort of delay the delta and think about different deltas. And so ultimately you can think about deviations that are sort of convex combinations of these sorts of things that I showed you, and the result follows.
Okay.
But it does require a proof. So I'm not showing you, this is an intuition, not a proof.
Okay, thank you.
Now, going back to Nicolas' previous observation that it's kind of, at first blush at least, it seems kind of surprising that the solution depends only on the maximum of the arrival rate. And let me give you another intuition that's beyond the technical, just because it will feed into what we talk about when we discuss the two risky projects. So one underlying principle in this project, which is certainly not new, is that news is useful only insofar that it affects exploitation. So only actionable news is useful. Now, if you exploit project L, this means that only good news on project H will alter your exploitation. Project L, you already know everything about it. So the only way you're going to switch is if you learn that project H is actually superior. If you're exploiting project H, then it's only bad news on project H that will change your mind. You already know everything about project L. So that's kind of useful to keep in mind. So now let's think about two good news settings that differ in their arrival rate of bad news. So we're thinking about a good news setting, and one has arrival of bad news that's denoted with lambda, and one that is denoted with mu. And now I'm going to try to argue to you in a hand-waving fashion that the optimal decisions will coincide in these two problems. So let's think about setting a posterior P where it's optimal to exploit project L when the arrival rate of bad news is mu, is the lowest of the possible two. So now when you exploit project L, as we've said, it's only good news on project H that alters which project you exploit. That's the only thing that will make you switch what you exploit. So now with a higher rate of bad news arrival, it's still optimal to exploit project L. You don't care about the arrival rate of bad news because the only thing you care about is the arrival of good news. Now, suppose that at a posterior P, it's actually optimal to exploit project H when you have a lower arrival rate of bad news. So now it's only bad news on project H that alters what project you exploit. And so if we increase the rate of arrival of bad news, that can only help. This means that the time to bad news is even shorter if project H is bad. So certainly it's still optimal to exploit project H. Okay, so the last thing I'll tell you about the one safe project case is what happens with payoffs. So we can calculate the expected payoffs to understand the importance of disentanglement, just to see how much of an effect it has. Now, first of all, just to highlight the fact that things are non-monotonic here, let's think about two extremes. One, when the agent is very patient. So when the agent is extremely patient, it really doesn't matter what level of disentanglement we have. The agent is going to learn the optimal project pretty quickly in terms of effective time, in terms of what matters for payoffs, and get paid very close to the optimum. So here, disentanglement is not going to be critical. Now, similarly, if the agent is extremely impatient, then again, regardless of the disentanglement, there's kind of no hope. So the agent is extremely impatient. There's no way they're going to learn the optimal project with decent probability. And this entanglement just doesn't matter for payoffs. They're going to get something close to the myopic payoff. So this is just kind of non-monotonicity in the discount rate. And now I'd like to just show you some pictures to give you a sense of how it behaves with respect to other parameters. So just to illustrate pictures, we're going to focus on the polar cases of alpha equals to 1 and alpha equals to 0. So again, alpha equals to 1 is the classical model and alpha equals to 0 is fully disentangled. And we're going to depict the expected payoff difference. And just so that we compare apples to apples, we'll normalize by the full information expected payoff. So this is what would happen if you knew perfectly the realized project. So this is just to allow us to kind of look at comparative statics with respect to the prior probability that project H is good. So this is what it looks like. So what I'm showing you in these figures corresponds to pure good news or pure bad news. So we're just looking at one arrival rate being different than 0. The value of the rewards doesn't really matter here. It's just for illustration. We picked 10 and 15. It doesn't really matter. And we're showing you the picture for varying posteriors. And kind of you see various interesting things. First of all, it's non-monotonic, and the prior that project H is good. There's also a kink in the bad news case. So it seems kind of things are more extreme in the bad news setting. So just to kind of summarize it, it's non-monotonic. And the discount rate, as we've already discussed, and then the arrival rate of news, because those are interchangeable in this model. It's increasing in how important it is to learn whether the high project is good. Clearly, if they generate very similar rewards, disentanglement doesn't really matter. It's not, learning doesn't matter that much. It's maximal for a prior that's between Gittins and the myopic cutoff in the good news setting. So there's an intermediate value of priors at which it's optimal in the good news setting. And it's maximal exactly at the Gittins cutoff in the bad news setting. So these two, I'm not gonna give you the intuition. If you're curious, ask me in the discussion stage at the very end, and I would like to have some time to tell you about the multiple risky projects. All right, so just to kind of summarize the one safe project, this is basically what it looks like in pictures for the two extreme cases of fully disentangled and fully untangled. And what matters here is the probability that the risky project H is good. And we see that there is this region here, which is kind of this questionable region where you might want to exploit a project in order to increase your learning. And the cutoff of where you do it depends on the level of disentanglement. And furthermore, you see that for these low priors that project H is good, that's precisely when disentanglement has bite. That's exactly when you want to explore a different project than the one you're exploiting. All right, so now I'm gonna shift to the two risky projects. So we have two risky projects. So both PL and PH are lower than 1. And I'm going to start by focusing on the good news setting, where the arrival rate of good news is greater than bad news, or in other words, you become more pessimistic over time without news. Okay, so let's first discuss what happens in the classical model, where the exploration and exploitation are fully entangled. So you start exploring and exploiting the project with the higher Gittins index. And if you observe no news, then you become more and more pessimistic. And in fact, the Gittins index decreases as you become more and more pessimistic. And at some point, the two projects have exactly the same Gittins index. And from then on, you mix across the projects until you see news. So in some sense, there are infinite switches. You're constantly using both, unless you get news. If you get good news on one of the projects, you continue forever with that project. You see a jump in that project, then you shift to that project and you never learn about the other project. So you get stuck. So this means that you might get stuck even on a low project, potentially when the H project is actually good. So that kind of reflects this incomplete learning that might occur in the classical setting. Now, just as a break to kind of applications, I mean, of course, this is an extremely useful model. But just to remind you, this was first suggested as a model of clinical trials. So Gittins and Jones said that the multi-armed bandits' chief practical motivation comes from clinical trials. Now, the reviews are not great. So just to give you some example, Armitage, an international statistical review in 1995, said yet most of the theoretical work done in this tradition over the last 20 years or so has found no application whatsoever in the actual conduct of trials. This lack of contact between theory and practice seems to me quite deplorable. Either the theoreticians have got hold of the wrong problem, or the practicing trialists have shown a culpable lack of awareness of relevant theoretical developments, or both. In any case, the situation does not reflect particularly well on the statistical community. Viller, Wason, and Bowden in 2015 say the Gittins index development was originally motivated by the problem of optimal patient allocation in multi-armed clinical trials. However, it has never been used in practice. These are pretty bad Yelp reviews, but really, when you see this infinite switches, it's hard to think of this being done in applications. Now, it's not that I'm saying that our model is necessarily superior for clinical trials. Probably the classical model actually is a better fit for that applications, but it's something to keep in mind when we think about applying these sorts of models to the real world. Okay, so
Leeat, can I just note something that although this may have been, it may have taken a while. I mean, tech companies that A/B test nowadays, they do actually, well, often not A/B test anymore, but do something that is, I guess, basically they use the Gittins index. Now, Google even has tools that companies can use to automate this. So it is used in practice, no?
Yeah,
in some sectors.
Oh, that's interesting. I mean, it doesn't surprise me. I mean, I think the model makes a lot of sense for many applications.
Yeah, but so it seems like it's finally landed in at least some sectors of where clinical trials are done. Anyway.
All right, so now we're gonna analyze our model. So we're gonna assume that alpha equals to 0. This will really allow us to analyze everything analytically and simplify the problem somewhat. So the exploration and exploitation are going to be fully disentangled. And in this case, the exploitation is actually trivial because you want to exploit at any period the myopically optimal project. Before, the only kind of tension came from the fact that what you exploited constrained what you could explore. Here, there is no constraint, so you may as well just exploit the myopically optimal project. Now, if you observe at any point good news on project X, then we know what happens. Because if you observe good news on project L, then we're back to the one safe project case that we just analyzed, and you want to explore project H. If you learn that project H is good, then life is awesome, and you exploit project H forever, and it really doesn't matter what you explore. Now, if you observe bad news on project Y, then clearly you should exploit the other project. And again, there's not much you can do in terms of exploration. You might explore that other project as well, but if you learn that it's bad, then life sucks and you really have nothing to do. So you can, if both projects are bad, you can exploit either one. It doesn't matter, you're getting 0. Okay, so now I want to characterize the full exploration strategy. And to do that, it will be useful to have one tiny piece of notation. So I hope you bear with me. And it's the following. So suppose that project X is active, or it's the myopically optimal project. So it's the one that generates a higher expected utility at the moment. Now we can find T bar, which is the time till indifference between the two projects in terms of expected utility. So because we're in the good news setting, if you explore project X, if you don't see news, you become increasingly pessimistic. And at some point, you'll become indifferent between the two projects. That's the time T bar. And just to put it in pictures, this is what it looks like. So suppose that project X is project H, just for an example. You start here somewhere, and at some point, as time goes by and you don't observe news, you hit indifference between the two projects. That's this time T bar. Okay, so now we're ready for our characterization. So suppose that project X is active, or it generates the higher expected utility myopically. Then generically, the optimal exploration strategy has the following form. Either you explore the other project until you see news, or you explore project X for a certain duration, which is lower than this T bar that we just defined. So you don't wait till you become indifferent, you stop before that, and then explore the other project until you observe news. So effectively, indefinitely until you see news. Furthermore, if we're in the classical good news setting, there's an optimal strategy in which the agent never switches. So either you always look at project L until you get news, or you always look at project H until you get news. So notice that in contrast with the classical setting, here you're switching your exploration absent news at most once. So now I'm going to try to give you some intuition for why we see so few switches and why the optimal exploration seems to take this form. And I should note before that even in the exploited projects, you actually switch them at most twice. So very few switches in this problem, both of exploitation and exploration. All right, so first of all, let me give you some intuition for why the stark difference between the classical setting and this setting. And for that, it's useful to focus on an example. So think about a situation where the two projects are identical. So the prior probability that project low and H are good is the same, their rewards upon being good are the same, and their arrival rates are the same. And we're looking at classical good news where the arrival rate of good news is strictly positive, but it's 0 for bad news. So this is kind of a very particular setting. Now, in the standard model, we start from a point where you're completely indifferent. So this is exactly the setting where you're going to mix between the two projects equally until you get news. Now, in contrast, and when there's full disentanglement, you're going to exploit one project and explore the other until news. Now, why is that? Intuitively, after any infinitesimal time, one project is going to be optimal. If you observe any project for a small amount of time, that project is going to dominate because you're going to, or the other one of the projects is going to dominate because you're going to become more pessimistic about the project that you're exploring. Now, news is useful only insofar that it affects your exploitation choices. So if you divide your attention or exploration, you're going to receive news that lead to a switch at half the arrival rate. So suppose I'm exploiting, project L, and now mixing the exploration, the only thing that will change what I exploit is good news on project H. But if I'm mixing the exploration, I'm gonna explore project H and potentially learn that it's good at a lower rate. So that's suboptimal. So that's kind of what's causing this persistence. Now, let me give you a more general intuition, still hand waving for the proposition. So suppose that you explore some project Y. Then after some time without observing any news, you exploit project X because you become increasingly pessimistic about project Y. Now, again, news is useful only insofar that it affects exploitation. So now only good news on Y can cause you an exploitation switch. You're exploiting project X, exploring project Y. So the optimal exploration has to depend on the rate of arrival of good news, not of bad news. And now it feels awfully like what we showed you for the one safe project case. So if it depends only on the arrival rate of good news, now we can think about problems with various arrival rates of bad news. In particular, you can take the bad news arrival rate to approximate the good news arrival rate, which is precisely the balanced news setting. Now, in the balanced news setting, when both good news and bad news arrive at the same rate, no news is truly no news. There is nothing you learn from no news because the arrival rates are the same. So in the no news, in the balanced news setting with absent the arrival of news, the optimal exploration doesn't change because the problem is effectively the same. Nothing changed in your posteriors. And that's the end of the kind of more general intuition. So what we just showed you is that you have a lot of stickiness. What we didn't address is which project you start from at the outset. So under balanced news, this is actually a very extreme useful case because in this case, when you start observing a project, you're always going to stick with it until you observe news. Nothing changes. The problem is completely stationary unless you get news. Your posteriors don't move around without news. So here it's very natural to ask what should you observe initially. So let me kind of give you the general formula. So in the balanced news setting, the agent explore project X if and only if this inequality holds. So it's an inequality that has in it the arrival rates of the projects and 1 minus some adjustment of the posterior. Okay. Now it kind of makes sense that the higher the arrival rate, the more appealing it is to explore that project that generates more information. And the further away you are from certainty, the more you can learn, the greater marginal informativeness of a unit of time spent exploring that project. So it's kind of intuitive that we'll have some multiplication or some term that depends both on the arrival rates and on 1 minus the posterior or something like it. So this this actually has a nice intuition. Now, if I have a few minutes at the end, I'll give you an argument for why there is no index. But in fact, this sort of proposition actually suggests that there is no index on exploration. So I already asserted it at the outset, but in fact, one of the interesting things in this problem is that despite having the same degrees of freedom as in the classical problem, here there is no index that governs the exploration. All right, so just to kind of explain the initial choice, if the expectation of the two projects is exactly the same, you explore the project for which the posterior moves more rapidly. This is kind of more information value. So you explore project H if and only if this inequality holds. And this is kind of the intuition that I just gave you. You want arrival rates that are higher and posteriors that are further away from certainty. Now, otherwise, there is some project that's quote unquote inferior. This is project X here. Now, information about this project X has a smaller impact. It kind of takes a while to catch up with the other project and actually translate into the choices of exploitation. And that's why we need to sort of quote unquote penalize it. And that's why there is this adjusted posterior in the formula. And in fact, we're describing this for the balanced news setting, but you can come up with formulas that are analogous even when it's not the balanced news setting, but strictly good news settings. But now you might need to penalize an active project where it takes you a long time to learn that you should use the other project if you look at it. So it takes a long time for the posteriors to decay till indifference and a switch in exploitation that results from it. So that's kind of, there would be an additional term that has to do with this discounted time. Okay, so some comparative statics. When the agent is incredibly impatient, they explore and exploit different projects. So the only way to learn quickly that what you're exploiting is the wrong thing is by learning that the other project is actually good. So that's what you do. You explore and exploit different projects. When the arrival rate increases, you're more likely to explore that project naturally. That's just an information value story. And in fact, you might get stuff that doesn't look like the classical model. So in some regions, increasing the reward or increasing the prior that the project is good, make the agent actually less likely to explore it, just because there's more information value in exploring the other project. And that's something that we don't see in the classical model. Okay, so in the few minutes that remain, I'll just kind of tell you what happens in the bad news setting. So suppose that the arrival rate of bad news exceeds that of good news, then the optimal exploration strategy has the following form. You explore project H until bad news, or you explore project L for some period T, or until you see news, and then explore H until you see news. So you can have some switching, but very little. Now, in the standard model, when you start exploiting and exploring a project, absent news, you become more and more optimistic about that project. So absent news, you always stick to the same project forever, effectively. So the only thing that switches what you exploit and explore is news. So here in our setting, you see actually more switches, unlike in the good news setting. So you must switch at least once or precisely once when you start exploring project L. And this is also in contrast with our good news setting, because with bad news, you can never explore project L indefinitely. So I'll give you just a rough hand-waving intuition, and then we'll conclude. There are basically two pieces to this puzzle. First of all, that you never switch when you explore project H. That's a bit more involved, so I don't have time for that. And that you always switch when you explore project L. So I'm going to focus on this case, although you'll see a hint of the first component. So suppose that project H is pretty promising. In fact, it's so promising that its expected value is greater than the reward from a good project L. Then this means that no news on project L would alter exploration. exploitation. So this means that you're going to explore project H, because that's the only thing that might actually change what you exploit, is bad news on project H. And if you don't receive these bad news, then you become more and more optimistic about project H and you continue. So this is a case in which you explore project H indefinitely. So now let's think about the complementary setting where PHRH is less than RL. So here, you might actually change which project you exploit if you learn that project L is good. Now, suppose that project L is explored, and suppose that it's explored for a really long time. So T is really, really long. So if you don't observe any news, the probability that project L is actually good approaches 1. So now the probability, if you explore project L, the probability that you actually learn that you should switch goes to 0. But that's not the case with project H, which means that you can't explore project L indefinitely. Okay, so one implication here is the no index, but I'll skip the applications and just conclude here. So what I showed you is a simple framework for disentangling exploration from exploitation. We showed you that there are substantial effects, and we think it's potentially useful for a variety of applications. So that's all, folks.
Right. Yeah, thank you very much. So now we start the discussion. So Nicolas, do you have any remarks or anything to say?
We'll see. Sure, I can. Yes. So first of all, well, let me congratulate the authors on this very interesting and great project. Yes. So if you're an economic theorist like me, I guess sometimes you struggle with the concept of generalization. Yeah, so your mathematical self says, well, generalization is always good. Yeah, your economic self says, well, it has to be realistic and fit the application. But here, there's really no trade-off, right? So both selves say this is a good generalization, right? Because well, obviously, it's disentangling exploitation from exploration. Well, just makes sense from the point of view of the application. It seems to me, right? Yeah, the alpha, the alpha depends on the particular application at hand, I guess. Yeah, so if you're in a job, yeah, so you're exploiting your current employer, yeah, and well, if you're in our line of work, yeah, you can do a lot of exploration on the side. If you're factory worker, it's harder, yeah, etc. Yeah, yes. So and I think the generalization has been done in just just the right way, yeah, by taking the standard model, introducing a parameter which you can vary and play with and get comparative statics with, yeah. It seems to me that the idea of doing this disentanglement has been around in some other papers, not as well done, but I think I can think of several papers where maybe Kipalani and Matson, yeah, so where you first venture capitalists look, do their due diligence, look, yeah, and then take an action, yeah. So usually it's been done. I'm not aware of one where it's been done in such an natural and a nice way into this standard bandit setting. Yeah. Maybe the closest I could think of was a paper that came out. I think it was in that English journal, the Economic Journal. I think it is. Yeah. So by Damiano, Lee, and a third person. Yeah. So maybe you could comment a bit on that. Then yes, so it's a very unfair question. But again, just have you thought at all about what could happen with inconclusive news? Yeah. It seems to me that a lot of these very well, first of all, yeah, it's a very nice result that you had as proposition one. Yeah, so this Rothschild effect. Yeah, that you can get stuck on the wrong on the wrong option forever. Yeah, so it's really an artifact of the strict entanglement of the two, right? So as soon as you can do a little exploration on the side, it goes away, right? But yeah, so I was wondering to what extent some of these starker contrasts might be predicated on the yeah, I don't, it's probably not an English word, conclusivity of the news, or on the fact that news is conclusive. Yeah. Yes. Oh yes. So and then I was also thinking of this. There's a very nice paper by Jean-Guillaume Ferrand, which came out a few years ago, where a decision maker was playing this bandit problem. Yeah, and he had to pay to keep options open. Yeah. And yeah. So I was wondering whether there's some deeper connection to that. Probably not, but yeah. So just wondering because yeah. So here exploring is like keeping. Yeah, it's you explore to keep the option open of exploiting someone, some other arm. Yes. So now, of course, with just two arms, I'm not so sure how costly exploring the option I'm not exploiting is, but yeah, again, very unfair. Is there any chance of looking at three arms? Yeah, so that yeah, suppose you exploit option X, yeah, and then you have a real cost to exploring option Y rather than Z, right? Yeah, that might be more feasible than the non-conclusive news. Yeah, so the non-conclusive seems. Yeah, I don't know. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So maybe just a few random thoughts thrown out there for the time being. If you,
should I respond?
Sorry.
No. Oh, sorry. I don't mean to cut you off, Nicolas.
Yes, please. Sorry.
I don't have super interesting responses to you. The conclusive news, we know it's more complicated. I mean, we know it even from the classical settings. So you know, these proofs that I showed you are already not trivial. And I guess for the first paper, perhaps we were too lazy, I don't know, but this was kind of, it seemed like if we added inconclusive news, it would become a monster of a manuscript. So we're not doing it yet.
I'm sure it would, so that's the next one.
Yeah, so But let me just hint at the fact that I'm not sure some of the stark differences would not be present still. So for example, this idea that if with even a minuscule level of disentanglement, you're still going to learn indefinitely. And so even with inconclusive news, you'll, asymptotically are going to learn with the, if we're thinking about a reasonable model, the way it's been modeled in the past. So I think some of the stark differences will remain, but of course the devil is in the details, and we don't know those details, admittedly. With 3 projects, I think that's a great question, and we would love to know the answer. Again, we know that some features remain, but the full characterization is going to be more complex, and we have some idea of why it becomes more complex, but this seems like a separate project. I should say that almost the entire literature on bandits and economics is focused on 2 bandits, in fact, on the One Safe project case that we highlighted. Now, payment for remaining for options remaining open. I'm not sure this is like the best place to look at it. One thing and let me give you some intuition for why I think maybe it's not the greatest in our setting. We thought a little bit about endogenizing alpha, this constraint. So you can think about doing it in the most, textbook way possible, like what you would give grad students as a problem set, like, just associate the cost to alpha and then maximize with respect to alpha, and we have the solution for alpha. The thing is, this is not a very well-behaved problem with respect to alpha. So the value is not concave in alpha. So of course you can still solve this problem. It's a calculus problem, but you might get corner solutions, and it's not super well-behaved. I do think it's an interesting problem of these decaying options, and I've thought a little bit about it in other contexts, but here in truth we haven't done anything in that direction. The Damiano and Lee paper I'm not familiar with, so I would love a reference.
Sure, I can find it. Yeah.
Right. Thank you very much. And so now there would be still a couple of minutes of time if someone else wants to ask a question.
Can I ask a?
Sure, please.
I actually have one question and one silly comment. So, but first question. So, on the three arms, or maybe even on a bit more ambitious on K arms, I think it'd be interesting to think about the alpha parameter and that being sort of a pairwise dependent in a sense, right? So where depending on which project you're currently exploiting, the availability for exploration is different. So application wise, I think it's a very reasonable kind of assumption that in order to explore something that is, let's say very ambitious, first you have to move closer to using that in practice, and then you can, and the silly comment is the exploitation term is fantastic for a title because it rhymes and everything, but when you talk through the theory, it takes a lot of cognitive resources to distinguish between the exploration and the
exploitation. Yeah. We've been debating about this between us.
So maybe using some very different words like studying and milking or something like this.
No, I see where you're coming from. I should mention kind of what you just said about the multiple arms, and I should have told you, Nicolas, about this. I didn't get a chance to show you about some of the other stuff that we're thinking about as kind of spin-offs from this project. And one of them, one way to handle multiple projects is actually in a somewhat different setting of kind of a Pandora box. And Nikita, it feels like maybe it's in the spirit of what you're thinking. I'm not sure, kind of we thought about almost tiers of jobs, and you're climbing up those tiers. And in every tier, you're basically facing a Pandora box problem. So for those who are not familiar, it's kind of the sequence of boxes. So think about them as jobs. And every time you try a job, you learn perfectly the reward or the quality of the match from that job. And once you found a good job in a particular tier, there's no reason for you to look for a substitute job in the same tier. It's going to generate the same reward at best. So the only reasonable thing for you is to climb up tiers. And that's something where we can actually have a handle on the analytics. So that sort of formulation, we can actually get precise solutions, but it's a very particular case of multiple projects.
Right. So, yeah, since we're getting to 5:15, let me finish the official part by thanking very much Leeat and Nicolas for the talk today, and come back next week for Laura Duval, or stick around